Schadee is a senior lecturer in European history at the University of Exeter. She took her degrees in history at the University of Oxford and has held fellowships as well as a BSR, where she currently is for 3 months at Princeton University and also in Munich. As we will hear, and from her previous scholarship, she is interested in uses and abuses of the past, including classical reception and the history of scholarship, with a research focus on humanism in the Italian Renaissance, as we shall hear in this talk. So, I hope that you have all heard Hester's lecture, but we thought it would be a good place to begin with a little recap for 5 minutes, just to give Hester an opportunity to go over some of the salient points and give you an opportunity to think about questions that you might not have asked in advance, but we would be very willing to hear and look forward to Hester answering. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for the reassurance that the sound works, so that's great.
Yeah, for some people. If it stops working, do let us know. I mean, the whole idea is that, you know, this is actually audible and not just noise, you know, as much as we can help it. So, I'll just give a very brief summary of the lecture. Actually, I'll give you a one-line summary, which I owe to my brilliant colleague from Exeter, Hester Schadee, who wrote to me after watching the pre-recorded lecture on YouTube. And she said it's really a process of elite self-identification with certain order structures as part of a simultaneous effort at self-promotion and place promotion. And I think that's exactly what it is. It's in this case, it's about how a particular group of people at a particular time uses or adapts the idea of Rome, uses it first as a shared currency in network building, and secondly, uses it as cultural capital. And the distinction I'm going for there is, you know, the network is using Rome as a means to connect to other people. The cultural capital is, you know, using Rome as a means to magnify yourself by association with that place, which you simultaneously magnify. In terms of time, I'm looking at the time when one might expect the image of Rome to be changing, the time that we would roughly call the early Renaissance, for lack of a more precise term. So in this case, I'm looking at the early 15th century. Question being, of course, what does that mean for Rome to talk of this in terms of the Renaissance, seeing that Rome is traditionally treated as a bit of a backwater when it comes to Renaissance culture, especially compared to Florence. And then, you know, looking at the time in Rome, you automatically come to the question of how does the return of the papacy from Avignon to Rome, with the installation of Rome of Martin V in 1420, how does that change that picture? So in a little bit more detail, who are these people? The protagonist of the talk is Cincius Romanus, who styles himself Cincius Romanus in Latin, so Roman. And he works in the curial and papal court as a secretary, well, first probably as a scribe, but very soon as a secretary from 1405 roughly to his death in 1445. The interesting thing about Cincius is that he's of Roman extraction, so he's a good case study for what happens in Rome with that arrival of the Renaissance. And he's also at the forefront of the humanist avant-garde, if you will. He's the first to learn Greek, for instance, in Rome, with the Greek scholar Manuel Casorodas. Cincius is also a close friend of the somewhat famous humanist Poggius Florentinus, who styles himself Poggius Florentinus in Latin. So you've got the Romanus and the Florentinus working together in curia. Poggius, as I say, is actually much studied within the sort of small niche of humanist studies. But Cincius, not so much, since to do seminal articles and partial editions of his really rather limited output. And there's an edition, well, there's an article by Max Lehnert from around 1901, 1902. And then there's another article by Ludwig Berthelot from 1929 and 1930. But after that, there's not that much. And so what I've done here is I thought, in some ways, the fact that he's close to Poggius means that you can sort of use Poggius both as a source of evidence for Cincius, because in Poggius' copious correspondence he talks about him. Cincius becomes a figure in his literary output, his dialogues, and so on. But you can also use Poggius as a foil to Censure, like you can see where their careers differ, and you know, question why that is. Likewise, I thought because Censure is Roman, he can be embedded in a sort of Roman social scene that he's part of by birth. I mean, he's part of curia by profession and part of humanism by choice. He's also, you know, part of the social scene in Rome by birth. And by sort of seeing the families he's connected to, I thought again, you can sort of use those as a foil or comparison for fleshing out his social setting. What can we infer about Censure? And then I found that he links to two families in particular, the Roman family of Della Valle and the curial family of the Cesarini, who make cardinal. Actually, one of them is cardinal at the same time of Censure's work in Curia. So basically, those are, you know, the themes I trace in my talk, which came in three parts, more or less. First, placing the rustici in Rome's social setting, like the rustici as a sort of rustic elite, and outlining their social ascent in comparison to the Della Valle. And also I discussed, which turned out to be quite important, precisely where Censure lived and where he is buried, where you can see his tomb to this day. The second part of the talk focused on the issue of patronage, so the social clubs, as it were, that these people belong to, particularly the Sanctuary of Sancta Sanctorum, also the role of faction, the Colonna faction. Martin V, of course, is a Colonna Pope, so that matters, which means he's Roman by birth as well. And from that sort of, you know, Rome as a lived experience in patronage, I moved to Rome as an idea in the letters that Censure writes to fellow Romans, particularly to the aforementioned Cesarini. I also compared briefly to other early humanists in the sort of image of Rome that they create, people from the same circle, Fisoloras, also Pierpaolo Virgilio, but also with contrast to previous writings, Petrarch obviously, as well as the non-humanist tradition in the Mirabilia, medieval descriptions of Rome. And you know, then finally, well, first, like, I suppose that sort of literary analysis shows certain things they do with the image of Rome in writing, and then finally I'm interested in if and how that translates to them doing things with the material remains of the city, like essentially collecting antiquities one way or the other. Collecting inscriptions perhaps is the most obvious way from the text to the material, because they're still sort of textual fragments. So that's kind of what I've done in that talk. Also, I should say it's still on YouTube, so you know, if you haven't watched it and this thing hasn't put you off too much, you can still go and watch it after this talk.
Thank you very much, Hester. I've just seen one comment that says it's too, there's still a little bit of echo, the sounds. So let me just try one thing. Do it. We can do it with the, it's a suggestion that we can use it with the computer microphone. So I hope that's better for any of you who found that slightly difficult, but it seems that in the main everyone can hear, so we'll keep going with that. And thank you for that introduction, reintroduction, Hester. It's really helpful to bring us all up to date. Brilliant, and everyone says that the sound is good, so I'm very pleased and we can relax and enjoy it. So I wanted to, well, actually ask you, you've had the opportunity to look at some of the questions that were asked in advance, which actually we're talking about this, about how, you know, it's a different process and gives you an opportunity to think, which is good. And we both thought that it would be nice to start with a question from John Osborne, who is actually our first speaker for next term. So thank you very much, John. And I'm sure you're still there and listening, I hope. And his question was really about, well, actually, I'll start from the end. He says, I fully agree that antiquarian interests are dramatically intensified in the 15th century, but I'm not convinced that they're really new. And I suppose that's the point he was getting to, is, you know, when did this interest in antiquity begin, and did it begin earlier. I suppose his point is that you can see it earlier than 1420 and into the medieval period. So I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about John's question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wanted to start with that because I think, that's an entirely legitimate point to make, and also in the question which was longer than Harriet could summarize, obviously, there are some really good examples of engagement with the antique past in very similar ways to my people, as it were. And so I agree essentially with John Osborne's point. Although I don't know enough about some of the medieval examples he's giving to speak to those. I mean, I think, to be honest, that Renaissance really just doesn't do itself any favors by insisting on novelty. It's essentially a humanist trope. They want to define themselves as doing something that's different from their predecessors, and they've been pretty successful in selling that story to the point that we still buy into it. And I think, again, you might say the same for current academia. We need to prove the relevance of what we do. So there's always a sense that if you work on modernity or the inception of modernity, you've somehow proven that this is not some kind of irrelevant past, but in fact something that speaks to us now. So what's easier than the Renaissance? If you want to claim, the beginning of a recognizably early modern and then modern world. So, I think that that's something that kind of still bedevils our approach. And I'd be quite happy to say that perhaps the only difference between what my Renaissance humanists do and their predecessors is that sense of self-conscious novelty. The stress of it, the self-cultivation of an image of innovation is perhaps the only difference that there really is. Or perhaps maybe it's also a matter of critical mass in a way. Perhaps there are simply enough Poggios and Cincios to make this new view of Rome a thing, whereas, for instance, there was only one Quasi and certainly only one Master Gregorius, to give John Osborne's example here, who wrote about Rome in his case, the 12th century. So I'd be much happier to say that there is a quantitative difference than a qualitative difference compared to earlier instances of antiquarianism. Moving to the particulars, I mean, Coladidienzo, of course, could be counted as an early humanist. Master Gregorius, I mean, I did look at his narration about the Mirabilia of Rome, which is very different from the Mirabilia, even when it comes to the Latin, actually. I mean, he writes a very different style of Latin, it's quite pleasant to read. What I was wondering, if I wanted to set him apart from the people I'm looking at, is, and this doesn't qualify him as an antiquarian at all, I mean, perhaps quite to the contrary, is that he seems to be rather more specific in his engagement with some of those monuments that he sees than the early humanists who actually often don't go into the particulars because they want to stress the fragmented state of Rome. They want to stress the ruins of Rome rather than, try and identify what is still there and what could be reduced. I mean, obviously that changes with Biondo and his triumphant Roma instaurata. So, but I think at the turn of the century there is an element of studied vagueness to it, if you will. I mean, I'm reminded of Panofsky's famous dictum, that the Middle Ages left antiquity unburied, the Renaissance took weeping at its grave. That's very much what they do. And also with the early humanists, you've got a certain wistfulness that comes with that sort of, that sort of study of the ruin. It's all about changing fortunes, which they labor quite a bit. Sorry, I'm going on perhaps for too long.
No, it's interesting. It definitely I think it's a big question that deserves a big answer.
I mean, I'm really just say one more thing to John Osborne's question, which is like the most interesting part to me, because I know least of it, is the use of spolia in the Middle Ages. Because like when I'm looking at people collecting inscriptions and maybe like putting these inscriptions on display in their own houses, I mean, obviously Rome is full of bits of marble immured in churches, immured in sometimes even private houses, perhaps. Like what's the substantial difference between spolia collection and inscriptions collections? And you know, there are some things you could think about, you know, indoors, outdoors, public, private, clerical, you know, secular. There's things you could do, but I'm not sure there's you know, that I have a you know, definitive answer to that, especially if you think of the Casa dei Crescenzi, where you actually have spolia as well as inscriptions. So I just wanted to say, John has also asked for a reference to Cencio and the Schadee. So when I get you Cencio's article, I'd be very grateful for anything that you think I should read about spolia and Middle Ages for, you know, for comparison to my own work.
Yes, I can see your project. After this, your project's going to end up huge, and then it's going to come back in again.
Yeah, so it goes.
So, well, thank you for answering that, and I think that kind of introduces a lot of points that other questioners are picking up on. The beauty of having Hester here and coming to the end of the 3-month fellowship is that she's become a really key part of the community, and clearly what we're doing tonight is kind of echoes the conversations we have over dinner. So what's and in informal settings. So what's fantastic is that a number of our fellows have contributed questions, both artists and the humanities award holders, and we're thinking about the different perspectives that they bring to it. And so the first question from our award holder, and I've named them because it's very nice that they contribute, is from Jeff, and he actually asked 2 questions in his comment, if you like. But I think potentially the more interesting of them is kind of this idea of the papacy returning from Avignon to Rome. And I think the nugget of this question is, did this kind of move and transfer and return to Rome help, you know, open up and basically give people new lenses and prisms with which to see the city?
Yeah, I think it depends on like how specific you want to make that, because I think if it's a matter of like, you know, do you see Rome differently once you've been living in Avignon? It's not quite like that, because they aren't the same people. There's, you know, first the papacy is in Avignon, but then there's this intervening periods of the papal schism where you've got like one papal claimant in Avignon and one in Rome. And then at some point, like you have very briefly an attempt to resolve that, which you know involves the creation of the third pope, who should supplant the other 2 contenders, but that doesn't work. So you've got 3, and in the end that's resolved, and all 3 are forced to abdicate. And then you've got the election of a new one, who is himself a Roman, namely Martin V. So it's not in that sense as if he comes from Avignon and then sort of sees Rome with French transalpine, you know, eyes. It's not like that. But if you look at it less strictly, in the sense that obviously Rome having been, you know, this sort of holy grail, that's probably a mixed metaphor I shouldn't be using, but you know, this kind of place of sort of longed for, you know, promised land almost for at least a significant part of Italians and people and Lebanese. You know, the whole 14th century, like Italian literature, Dante and so on, is always about, you know, Rome being bereft of the papal see. So you know, then when the city is back, I think it does perhaps suggest, you know, that you actually engage with that place that you have reoccupied in a way. And actually, in addition to the papacy returning, there's also, of course, the constant clamoring in the 14th century for the Holy Roman Emperor to be returning to Rome. That one doesn't work out. But for both of them, they're very contemporary concerns, to get the Pope back and to get the Emperor back. And I think the only thing that happens really perhaps is that in 15th century, you know, there's also Rome, the ancient Rome, that needs to be kind of somehow domesticated and brought back to life.
I think, yeah, that actually picks up on a point which also came from another award holder, Claire Burridge, because, you know, we were thinking about yeah, we were talking about the return to Rome, and she asked a number of questions, but one of them is about movements and networks. She says she's interested in the movement of individuals involved in the family and patronage networks you laid out. So some people moved around a bit. They left Florence to work for the papacy and came to Rome. And then, you know, we also have examples of manuscript hunts and talking about basically the gravitational pull of Rome. But also she sees this as a two-faced coin. You know, there's a flip side to this, which is families moving beyond Rome. So I wonder whether those sorts of observations are helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked extensively, perhaps, in, I mean, you know, like the people, look at most of Usticchi and the Della Valle. I've studied them in Rome, so I'm not, you know, but I mean, certainly, of course, they study elsewhere. For instance, like, I mean, many of them study of the Della Valle study in Padova or in Bologna, because Rome obviously it's not a university city in that way. You've got the Roman studio or studium orbis, which Tencho later works for as well. But I think, I probably should look into that more, but I think they offer kind of a humanist training, and if you want a more professional training, paradoxically, from my perspective, you need to go to university, which is mostly Padova and Bologna. So they certainly travel, but they do come back, and actually, especially might contrast that to, you know, the professional humanist, somebody like Poggio, who makes his living through, you know, not being a lawyer or a medic or a theologian, but actually through his knowledge of the classics. Those people tend to be more itinerant, I suppose, because they need patronage. I mean, and charitably, you might say they have no real skills, you know, based on humanities. So, you know,
I love humanity. We're getting some questions, thank you, through the Q&A function in Zoom, so it'd be really nice to bring everybody in. We do have a sort of logic to it, but I don't think it will break it up at all. So I think Fabrizio Navola is your colleague, so I'm sure he says hello. So thank you very much, Fabrizio, for listening. And your question, he said he's struck how material your project has become in terms of topography, which is something, because there's also other questions that we can return to that, and objects, actual inscriptions collected as objects, not just transcribed text we're talking about. How much do you think the project has been shaped by actually being in Rome and spatialising the research you do? And then he's got a second question, but which is interrelated, so perhaps you want to hear them both and then you can sort of digest them. He says, is how much material evidence there is for humanists, in puts that in inverted commas, style collecting of inscriptions and sculptures along the lines of the well-known 15th century ones? And how much would you want to be predate the sort of collections discussed by Ren Christian and others as a practice?
Yeah, thanks, Fabrizio. I mean, that's exactly right. I'll take the last one because it's the difficult one first. So I was obviously hoping that I would be able to backdate some of the stuff, some of the collections by studied by Ren Christian, you know, I mean, Della Valle later had an extensive collection, Schadee later had an extensive collection. The Usticchi have some inscriptions. I mean, they're clearly not as you know, culturally splendid in the 16th century as their associates in the 15th century. So I was hoping through the figure of Tencho, who has such good cards in a sense for being a collector, I was hoping to actually put something together. But I think it's one of those things where, you know, Ren Christian, you know, it's a fantastic good empire without end. And you know, I mean, there's a reason why she starts roughly I mean, she starts in 1350, I believe, but I mean, most of those collections really only pick up in the second half of the 15th century. And I think it is because there just isn't much evidence earlier, and you know, is evidence of, you know, absence evidence, you know. But I've been trying, and even with Tencho, as you could hear in the lecture I put on YouTube, I thought, fragments of possible links to inscriptions, but it's really quite thin. So, I've tried to backdate, but I'm not convinced it's actually possible to do that in the way that I want it, which is also in some ways why this is turning more into a study of the social setting of some of these people, that sort of orbit the papal court. The first question, like how Rome has shaped it and how BSR has shaped it, it's been really important. I mean, I knew Rome reasonably well before coming, but it's very, very different when, when you can see these things inside, in situ, and you get a sense of, the connection between them, the distances. Also, just seeing, a tomb or an inscription for yourself is very different from seeing a photo of it, or let alone just a transcription. So for me, it's been absolutely crucial to be here in person.
No, absolutely, and we can, well, exactly, and we've been able to observe that process, that even in lockdown, you managed to get it, so that's really fantastic. I think, actually, you were talking about Censure in your previous answer, so I think that would lead on to Rosamund Kitterick's question. Actually, thank you, Rosamund, you've asked several, and we will, hopefully, we'll get to them all. But the first question you asked, which was, I think was interesting, is about his personal library. She says, Rosamund, thank you. There are hints that he might himself own some books in some of the papers, and she lists several of them. She says, I'm sure Hester knows them perfectly well, but perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit more about the library and what he might have owned.
I mean, Rosamund's of course right. I mean, we know some books we don't have a will or an inventory that gives a complete list, but we know some bits that he owned, some of the stuff that he's transcribed for himself. So we have got an autographed copy of Cicero's letters to friends, which he copied in Constance. The most interesting bit of his library actually is his Greek library, because in his will, his teacher, Poggius Florentinus, actually left Censure a quarter of his library. We don't know what quarter, so we can imagine that the text that Censure later translates from Greek into Latin, I mean, those will be part of the ones that he had from Poggius Florentinus. But there's probably more to it because that's only a handful, which doesn't seem to make a quarter of the library. So, but that's definitely something he had. Beyond that, I don't think I can add to the references that you also know.
So you brought some two important ideas in that answer, which is great. Books, which relates to and thinking about Greek as well, and those sorts of questions are coming through. So I guess it is Censure's tomb that he's lying on the books, isn't it? I haven't got that wrong. Have I got that wrong? Okay, then
that's fine. They're very similar.
Oh, okay. Well, then Rosamund had to talk a question about Censure's tomb. So actually, perhaps you could answer that, and then we can think a little bit about Greek. Should we do that? So Rosamund also wanted to know, could you say a little bit more about Censure's tomb, its inscription, epigraphy, and letter forms, and the imagery chosen for it, and who might have been commissioned to do it? The imagery for Filippo del Valle tomb is very striking.
Yeah. So I need to put up the PowerPoint again, which seems to have disappeared. Sorry, I'll send over in a second.
Don't worry, the questions are coming in thick and fast, so thank you. It gives me a chance to digest them as well. You don't have to kind of bits of paper frantically.
Okay, so. Sorry. There we go.
Yeah.
Should be coming up.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so so what I've done basically, I think just there we are. So I mean, what to say? Like the image isn't obviously great because it was, as I said in the lecture as well, it was very dark in the Santa Maria sotto Minerva. So this is sort of the best we could do. But as you can see, it's a very standard, Roman capital, the way you'd expect. in terms of details, actually here's the other one from Cincius son Agapito. I wouldn't vouch for it being identical to his father Cincius, but they're certainly very similar. And it's worth pointing out actually that these tombs are, as I said, they're done retroactively, so they're from the 1480s or 90s when these people died in the 1440s and 60s. And so it's a more modern Roman font than the original would have had, most certainly, well, almost certainly, because if you go to the, I'll come back to that, if you go to the Della Valle tomb in Santa Maria Arcieli, so I said in lecture, it's a composite of earlier pieces which have been put together, and you see it more clearly here. So in this, like the big one, is in the middle, and then you see to the left, that's the one for Paolo della Valle, who died in 1440, and I think that must be the original stone, which they simply moved into a later monument rather than recarving it as they did for Agapito and Cincius. And if you look at those letters, you really see, the sort of progress towards a cleaner Roman font. Also on the right, that's one for the brother of Paolo della Valle, so the uncle of Nello, who married Brigida de Busticci. And again, it's an older form of letter. It's also just not as well executed. I mean, again, the text in the middle is very crisp, very clear, super quality. The other one seems to me, a little less polished. So again, I mean, all that is evidence. It's not just art historians being niggly about sort of letter shapes, but it's evidence, I think, of their social ascent. I mean, the quality of their stuff, their material stuff, just gets better. It's also evidence of changes in fashion, like what Roman letter is in fashion at the time, but you also see an increase in quality. And I think on balance, the Della Valle are slightly ahead of the Busticci. If you look at the tomb of Filippo with the books, it's very, very nicely carved. I'll give you some. Yeah, this is a thing in situ actually. I had to, move the chairs in the chapel to get to it. But here you have some details. I hope it's coming through all right on the PowerPoint, and it's really crisply carved. It's beautiful. If we go back to the Busticci, it's also very nice. I just think it's not quite as nice as the Della Valle, but it's very similar in style. And one thing that strikes me as interesting, so obviously on the right you've got the portrait of Cincius. He's missing his nose, which is somewhat surprising. I mean, noses are always the first to go from statues, but he's fairly high up, so I'm not quite sure how he got damaged. But otherwise, he's intact. And his son, on the other side, you see an emblem, which clearly must be the Busticci emblem, because you get it on the tomb of Agapito as well. It's a lion with wings. In and of itself, a lion is common, wings are common, like an eagle, like maybe the imperial eagle, who knows. But the way the way it's arranged also reminded me a little of the old Pista Alberti's emblem, which has a winged eye, which also go in the same direction as the lion, and with that same kind of weird mixture of a frontal view and a side view. Of course, Cincius knew Alberti, who also kind of circled the curial. Whether that matters or not, I don't know.
I think you'll discover another 3 month residency. No, well, thank you for that. And actually, it's lovely to see some more visuals as well. And the more I can see that tomb with him lying on the books, better. Because I just think it's we have questions. Actually, a question from Connigan, who is one of our research fellows looking at Roman baths. And then we have a question which actually connects to Connigan's research as well. So if we could bring them together, then that would be great. So Connigan's actual question is, from what he's gathered from your lecture, the main interest of these collectors was inscriptions, so mostly technical evidence of the Roman past. And I suppose they had a pretty strong interest in material evidence as well. Did they also have an interest in architectural remains scattered around Rome as collectibles? And if so, how? In which form were they collecting them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure. It's very difficult to answer. So the reason it's so difficult to answer is that we know about the inscription at this early date because they get copied onto paper.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
So you get, syllages with, copied inscriptions, and they circulate in the form of books. Obviously, with architectural elements, you could draw them, but it's not quite the same, and they can't be used as historical evidence in the same way that inscriptions can. So it's also not quite as obvious why you would do that.
Yeah.
So for 15th century, you do sometimes get some architectural elements also copied alongside the inscriptions, but you don't get them so readily in that context by themselves. Now I'm actually thinking of Alberti, who of course is super interested in that sort of thing, and even actually I think makes some drawings when he writes about Rome, which later of course go into his treatises, the conclusion treatise on the art of architecture. But then again, I mean, he's a scholar of architecture, he's not an average collector. I mean, so again, of course, later, antiquity collections have all sorts of whatever, bits and pieces of reliefs and common hands and so on and so forth. But if you want to go earlier, it's hard to document. And maybe they didn't have it, but also if they did, it'd be hard to trace, I think.
No, it's interesting. And what you define as or describe as Roman rubble is what comprises Roman rubble.
I mean, certainly one thing is occurring to me now, like, when Poggio, for instance, he writes about, I think I put it in the lecture as well, he writes about wanting, marble faces from Greece. I think that's more accessible perhaps as well than like sort of architectural remains, something that's the human form has its own appeal, just like text has its own appeal. But,
well, no, it makes sense.
It's speculation.
No, I mean, that's the thing, is like teasing out these ideas and kind of putting it together. So I promised you more on baths. So we do have questions. Timothy Demetrius, Bards of Agrippa, and also thank you, Giacomo Savani. So Giacomo asks, could you tell us something about your identification, of Cencio's house and the influence that living inside the Bards of Agrippa might have had on his fascination with antiquity? So that's one kind of question that's come in, but also Timothy said, also in connection to these bards, I have a question for you. In your lecture, you questioned why Flavio Biondo refers to the Bath of Agrippa as being contingent with the Pantheon. He may have been referring to the Basilica of Neptune, which was part of Agrippa's larger building project. So I don't know if you want to think about the bards.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, that's great. I mean, I always assumed that, the point is just that at the moment they're not strictly speaking contiguous, because they're divided by the streets, and then you wonder like when that the division will come into being. And so I was happy to find that in the 16th century on the Bufalini map, there does seem to be a connection, and it's great to know that that's actually an ancient thing in the form of basilica for Neptune, which fits this idea of a portico or a colonnade. That we talked about, Colin actually talked about here quite well. So yeah, thanks very much. That's great.
That's great. That's cool. So let us. I'm just checking the time. So we've got about. I think you're happy to carry on. It's approaching 6:45. So if you're happy, we can keep going till 7 o'clock. No, it's really fascinating, and there's a lot of questions still coming through. I think we return to the pre-submitted questions. Of which I'd like to focus on one from Zoe, who's our colleague, and also Maria Harvey as well. So I think, yes, let's talk about the specific and then open it up a little bit. So Zoe is really interested in ideas of nobility. And she says, thank you for your wonderful paper. I'm really interested by the idea of rustic nobility, and especially the idea of nobility being associated with capital herding. She said, did the nature of what it meant to be noble change over the course of the 15th and 16th century in Rome? And was there similar closure of nobility? And how much was true nobility associated with office holding?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very much what this paper fits into, there is a closing off of mobility. I think in two ways. I mean, first, there is this point that cattle herding is clearly not what these people want to be known for. And, I mean, Poggio can say, oh, he likes that it's fine in Rome to be a cattle herder, but it's not fine beyond Rome. And these people going back to like networks beyond the city, they want to expand. They need to fit in, I think, elsewhere too, or maybe the norms are changing in Rome as well. So I think this whole push for learning and culture and so on is to create an urban veneer for what is essentially a rustic background. And doing that allows them to snuggle up to the traditional Roman elite, the colonna, Orsini, Savelli, and so on. The irony is that they do that, I think, by integrating themselves with the papacy. But then the papacy, of course, at the end of the 15th century becomes increasingly international, or actually it becomes mostly Spanish. First with the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, in 1492, and then, of course, with Spanish dominance in Rome and Italy after the sack of Rome in 1527. So, that makes it very hard, I think, for these local Roman families to move upwards, in a curial that becomes dominated by whoever, the powers that be in Spain and you want to put in place. So there is, I think, a successful ascent through the 14th century into the 15th century, but it sort of stops. And I think the local families, they'll become bishop, for instance, like one of Cincius Romanus, and again in the next generation, you've got a bishop, but they don't necessarily get to the state of the cardinalate. There's one Della Valle cardinal, obviously, Andrea Della Valle, who built the palace on the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, which is opposite the Basilica, the church, Sant'Andrea della Valle. So they have one, but I think that's as far as they get.
Oh, it's interesting. You're making me walk around Rome. This is the exciting bit as well. I've got talk about Jeff's question about looking with different eyes. My eyes are now I can't wait to get down. So shall we think about expansion as well? You talked about the Pope, papacy, curial, becoming more Spanish. Maria wanted to know about other cities. It's a big question. You clearly your focus is Rome, but she does think, she does ask because she has expertise in Neapolitan material. So I guess her question is, what I find particularly interesting about putting Naples and Rome in communication is their similar timelines in terms of the development of a Renaissance attitude to antiquities, while having different relations to the papacies. You argue for the return of Martin V as a catalyst for the human interest in Roman ruins. What about other cities? So I think we've touched upon this, but it would be good to kind of
Sure. So I mean, it'd be great to know more about Naples, and it's a shame Maria is left because I'd like to talk more about how this plays out in Naples. In fact, of course, it's a story that's, as I said in the beginning, right? It's a story that's not in itself unheard of, shall we say? It's a story of all times that the past is used one way or the other to bolster some redefinition of the present. So yeah, I'd like to know how Rome stacks up to Naples in that regard. I think you also mentioned Florence.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So she says.
Yeah, so I mean, Florence, of course, is a different story, precisely because, I mean, unlike Naples, I should have said that Naples obviously has a huge Greek legacy, so they've got Roman and a Greek past, unlike Rome itself, really. Florence is different because it has no classical past to speak of. I mean, of course, it was a Roman colony, but there's not much in Florence that really reminds you of its foundation as a colony of Rome. And nonetheless, they're sort of exercised by their Roman status in writing. So, people like Leonardo Boni, Coluccio Salutati, they argue about the foundation of Florence from Rome, about the republican sentiments that supposedly were transferred from Rome to Florence before the advent of the evil empire. but it's very much a written thing. There's no sort of actual remains to play with. So I suppose there's an argument even to be made that maybe Florentines are keener on finding actual remains and bring that sort of maybe they're more struck by it when they come to Rome, or they're looking for that from Rome. Certainly, Corvicius Salutati, the chancellor of Florence until 1406 when he dies. He's the person who encourages Poggia to start collecting inscriptions, because we know from letter of Salutatis to Poggia from 1403 that he thanks him for having sent copies of Roman inscriptions that he asked for. Also with the letter by Virgilio, which I briefly quote in the lecture, it's written in response to somebody, we don't know who has asked him for information about Roman remains. Virgilio is also a student of Salutatis in Florence before coming to Rome, so it's not impossible that Salutati, just like he's later asking Poggia for inscriptions, maybe asking Virgilio for bits on Roman remains. And it'd be interesting that the Florentine is looking for something that he doesn't have in his city, but is hoping to get from Rome, and then maybe that Florentine impulse also kind of galvanizes the local Roman elites. I mean, that's sort of, that would be ideal in the sense for my project, because then you can sort of trace something. On the other hand, you don't want to pin too much on a very small number of people.
And then I guess in doing that, you'll come back to, I guess, Jeff's second question, which is to think about markets as well. And the market for and how, once you start doing that research, whether there's a cultivation of taste, but it's the market fulfilling the taste for those types of objects.
I mean, the marketization of antiques is not, that's not a really interesting thing. I think that's kind of later than my period. The whole point is, which I've been struggling with, is that sense that actually, there isn't as much collecting as I would have liked to find. I mean, that's the sort of bit of and so clearly I don't think there's a market to begin with. It's not to say that all antiquities are without a market. I mean, the large slabs of marble obviously have a market. That's not because they're antique, that's because they're building materials. So the Pope sells privileges for literally mining marble. The whole Basilica Julia has effectively actually disappeared because there was a papal privilege to a particular company to mine it, either for building materials or worse, to burn it down for lime to make plaster. That's also why part of the whole sale is gone. The humanists obviously agitate against that. But for smaller bits and pieces which aren't as obviously useful, I think by the end of the 15th century, you aren't allowed to export antiques from Rome anymore, or maybe it's early 16th century, I'm not sure. But for my people, I think they can sort of do whatever people let them. Just dig things up. I mean, Poggia describes in his letters how he's like, in some Roman city gates, kind of like, cutting down the foliage to get to an inscription.
Like mushroom hunting or something.
And then
Getting up early.
There's a group of Roman, girls, like servant girls, who he writes like they're quite attractive. They're interested in what I do, so I tell them about the inscriptions, and they giggle like I'm crazy.
That's good. We giggle. Well, it's interesting. I feel that there's a thread through all these questions, but it's amazing how people are approaching it from so many different ways. Your brain must be about to because you're having to think so flexibly. So thank you. And if you can have if you could hold on for 2 more questions, then I think there's definitely an appetite. So
I will be able to see all the questions that I couldn't answer now. I will be able to see them all later and think about it. So even if I don't respond to now, they're still useful. It's still really nice that people have made the effort. So I will get back to it.
We'll we can have part B when you turned it into an article or both. So there have been and as I touched upon in the questions that were sent in before your lecture and also now on the screen, there's an interest in Greek. So we've got a few points. There's Claire mentions it, and also Susan Stewart asks it. So Claire, You've asked it to Claire's question, so thank you very much. So perhaps Susan distills it, so thank you very much for asking that. She says, Hester, I was intrigued by trying to study of Greek with Solaris. I wonder if you can reflect on any significant differences at this point in the human's reception of Greek and Rome. Did his knowledge of Greek refine those differences for himself and others?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I really like the way that's phrased. It's not just what does he do with Greece, but like how does that change his image of Rome?
Yeah,
and that's really interesting. I need to think about that more. It's not an easy one because like what's your comparison? You know, like what would he have done differently otherwise? It's not self-evident. I mean, I think I suppose off the top of my head, there's a couple of places to take this. So, you know, if you put Tensho's writings next to those of Physiologus when he's comparing Rome and Constantinople, you do get these obvious verbal parallels, which you also see in Virgilius' writings. So, in that sense, you might argue that they kind of copied Physiologus. I don't like that idea so much because it might be a two-way street. You know, it might be something that they explore together. At the same time, I think Physiologus writes very much in a tradition, rhetorically speaking, of Byzantine ekphrasis. You know, like the way you describe it in detail, architectural schemes, for instance, or objects. And that is, I think, something that, well, I suppose you get it in the Roman tradition as well, but I mean, he's doing it for something they can see for themselves, and that might change the way you write about these things. But that's still very much like on the page, you know. It'd be nice to translate that into like, you know, going back to Jeff's question as well about Avignon, like, do you look with different eyes when you know about Avignon? Do you look with different eyes when you know about Constantinople? That's what I would like to know and to have an answer to that one. I mean, certainly, I think, I mean, it must put some kind of Rome into some kind of relief, I would have thought, because, you know, Constantinople, of course, is modern Greece, but it's also living Rome. It's a bit of Rome that survived, right? And also Byzantium is continuation for them of ancient Greece, because, you know, if you know these sort of Renaissance paintings where if they want to depict ancient Greek people, they put them in modern Byzantine gear, Byzantine outfits, and there's a sense of continuity. So maybe it adds an extra relief to the loss of Rome to have that kind of glorious city still standing in the East. For as long as it stands, obviously, because then you get the Ottoman advance and that's that, but you know, it's a different story.
No, interesting. I know I haven't thought about it like that. So thank you. There's one more question which we could use to conclude on the screen from Helen Dixon. I want to know, are there any points from the questions that were sent in advance that we haven't touched on, that I have managed to skip? Was there a point that you wanted to?
I'm sure at least the people here, we can talk over them as well. So
let's leave it. So thank you very much to everyone that sent those in. Brilliant. As I said, I wanted, well, it's the beginning and an end, Helen Dixon's question, because she asked you about the beginning of your research, which is what led you to this topic, and then her kind of second part of the question is how do you intend to use the data you presented in your lecture to answer your research question, which is at what point does Roman rubble become collectible?
Well, the last one is difficult. As I said, it's a work in progress. I'm really glad with what I found about the rustici. I'm glad for myself with like how I've managed to understand these people in an urban landscape. You know, I usually work more with text, so to try and make this kind of spatial and three-dimensional and material, you know, that's been you know, a really useful thing to do. How it gets me closer to answering that question, I'm not entirely convinced of yet. It's also because, like, I mean, I've done mainly the rustici, and I've got like 2 weeks remaining, and there's plenty of other Roman families, with papal connections or human connections that I could look at, but I don't have time to do them all, so I'm not sure if we've got enough evidence to turn a case study into more generic answer, really. Unfortunately, I mean, well, I suppose you could take me back here to the BSR.
With pleasure.
Some more.
Yes, with pleasure. Well, I think that's. Thank you, Fabrizio, just make sure that it's not a question. He said thank you, and looking forward to seeing you at Exeter. So I think on that note, we can say I think you brought. I think one, thank you so much for suggesting this format for the BSR. It's really fun. Thank you to the ward holders who listened at the weekend. I could hear Hester's lecture on multiple pieces. And also to all those who submitted questions from beyond the walls of the BSR. It's really lovely to see that community coming together. And also, I should point out that we've got 3 Wolston Fellows. We've got Hester, Rosamond was a Wolston Fellow, and I believe John Osborne was as well. So it's nice to have, thank you to the kind of the continuing tradition. It's really nice to have that support. But most of all, thank you, Hester, because you've been fantastic. I think the questions stimulated shows that your project is really interesting and rich, and that's wonderful. But also to see your brain working from so many different perspectives, I know isn't easy, and I'm sitting here admiring that.
Right, so, thank you.
Because I've got millions of bits of paper school notes, but no, it's been really great to have you here tonight and to have us with us for the last 3 months. And I shall look forward to spending the next 2 weeks with you. And I didn't get any more comments about the sound, so I hope, beyond hope, that it was all right for everybody. And this has also been recorded, so we'll see what the quality of the recording is like and what we can do with this event. But thank you very much. It's always lovely that you could join the virtual BSR, and we should look forward to seeing you next week. So thank you very much. I shall end the session, which involves going over to the computer. So thank you very much, Hester, and thank you to our audiences. And yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Take it then.